My name is Clara and I'm 29 years old. 5 years ago, my mother called me 3 days before Thanksgiving and said 4 words that shattered everything. I thought I knew about family. We sold the house. I remember the smell of burnt coffee in my small studio apartment. I was leaning against the laminate counter. A stack of floral sketches for my next design project spread out before me. The radiator was clanking, a rhythmic metallic heartbeat that usually grounded me. But when those words hit the air, the sound became a deafening roar. "You what?" I asked. My voice sounded thin, like paper tearing. "We sold the house, Clara," my mother, Diane, repeated. Her tone was brisk, the same one she used when checking items off a grocery list. "It was just too much maintenance for your father and me. Victoria and her husband helped us find a lovely condo in the city. Gated community, gym, much closer to the kids. It's for the best." I felt a sudden, sharp coldness in my fingertips. I gripped the edge of the counter so hard the wood grain pressed into my palms. "The house, Mom? Grandpa's house? The one he specifically left to all of us?" "Oh, don't be dramatic," she sighed. I could hear the clink of a glass on her end, likely her afternoon Chardonnay. "It's a huge property." It was sitting there rotting. Victoria agreed that the market was peaking. "We closed this morning." Victoria agreed? My heart began to thud, a slow, painful rhythm. Victoria was my older sister, the golden child, the one who had married a hedge fund manager and produced 2 perfect grandchildren, the one who always knew exactly what to say to make me feel like an uninvited guest in my own life. "Mom, Grandpa's will said the house stayed in the family. He wanted it to be a sanctuary. He told me it was my inheritance, that because I didn't have the big salary or the stable life, I'd always have a roof over my head." "Clara, honestly," Diane's voice sharpened, "a will is just a piece of paper from 20 years ago. Things change. We needed the liquidity to help Victoria with the down payment on their new place in the Hamptons. And besides, you're doing fine in that little, what do you call it? An artist's loft? It suits you." I looked around my artist's loft. It was 400 square feet of drafty windows and a bathroom door that didn't quite latch. I had been working 3 jobs, freelancing as a graphic designer, arranging flowers for weddings on weekends, and waitressing at a bistro just to keep the lights on, all while knowing that one day I had a home to go back to. A home with a wraparound porch and a garden where the soil smelled like damp earth and memories. "Where is Dad?" I whispered. "He's outside loading the last of the boxes. We're heading to the condo now. We're having Thanksgiving there. Victoria is hosting. It'll be much more sophisticated than those dusty old dinners in the country." "Am I invited?" The question felt pathetic the moment it left my lips. It was a plea for a crumb of belonging. There was a pause, a long, agonizing stretch of silence where the only sound was the static on the line. "Well, about that," Diane said, her voice softening into that faux sympathy that always preceded a blow. "The condo is still a bit of a construction zone, and Victoria's in-laws are taking the guest suite. We thought, since you're so busy with your little projects, maybe you'd prefer to just stay in the city this year? We'll do a big brunch in the spring, once things settle." The air left my lungs. I reached out and touched the petal of a dried hydrangea in a vase on my counter. It crumbled under my touch, turning to gray dust. "You sold my inheritance to buy Victoria a vacation home," I said, the realization finally settling into my marrow. "And now you're telling me I don't have a place at the table for the holidays? You always make everything about you." "Clara," Diane snapped, her patience finally evaporating. "It's exhausting. We did what was best for the family. If you can't be happy for your sister, that's something you need to work on. I have to go. The movers are waiting." The line went dead. I stood there for a long time, the phone still pressed to my ear. I could smell the faint scent of the pumpkin candle I'd lit earlier, trying to make my small space feel like a home. Now, it just smelled like a funeral. I walked over to my desk and opened the bottom drawer. Tucked away in a faded manila envelope was a copy of my grandfather's handwritten will. He wasn't a wealthy man, but he was a man of his word. He had been a carpenter, a man who understood the value of a foundation. He had adored me. He used to sit me on his workbench and tell me that while Victoria had the flash, I had the soul. He promised me that the house would always be mine to keep, a place where my creativity could breathe. My parents and Victoria thought they had covered their tracks. They thought that because Grandpa's formal lawyer had passed away years ago, and because they had the original deed, they could simply erase his wishes. They saw me as the sensitive one, the one who would cry, perhaps scream, but ultimately retreat into the shadows as I always did. They thought I was just a girl with a sketchbook and a broken heart. I looked at the paper in my hand. My thumb traced the jagged ink of my grandfather's signature. Then I noticed something. A small folded piece of onion skin paper tucked into the very back of the envelope. One I had never fully opened because it looked like a mundane tax document. I unfolded it slowly. It wasn't a tax document. It was a codicil, a legal amendment signed, witnessed, and notarized 3 months before he died. It was dated much later than the will my parents had likely found. And it contained a single devastating clause regarding the sale of the property. Something inside me went quiet. Not sad, not angry, just empty. But as the darkness settled in, something else settled too. A quiet decision I didn't even fully understand yet. The onion skin paper felt like ice against my skin. I read the words once, then twice, my breath hitching in the back of my throat. My grandfather had known. He had seen the way the wind was blowing even back then, how Victoria's demands always outweighed my needs, and how my parents, Robert and Diane, were all too happy to play the role of her architects. The clause was simple. In the event of an attempted sale of the property by my heirs, the proceeds shall not be distributed until the youngest grandchild reaches the age of 30, or should the sale occur without the unanimous written consent of all named beneficiaries, the title shall immediately revert to a trust controlled by... The name at the bottom wasn't my father's. It was a legal firm in the city I'd never heard of. I leaned back, my head hitting the wall of my studio. The clanking radiator suddenly fell silent, leaving me in a vacuum of realization. This wasn't just about a house. This was the final piece of a puzzle I had been trying to solve my entire life. I closed my eyes and the memories came rushing back, unbidden and bitter. I remembered my 10th birthday. I had spent weeks asking for a professional watercolor set. I wanted to paint the world exactly as I saw it, vibrant, messy, and real. On the morning of my party, there was a large box wrapped in gold paper. My heart had soared. I tore it open only to find a designer tennis racket. Victoria is starting junior camp this summer, Diane had said, not even looking at me as she poured juice. It's better if you both have the same hobbies. It makes the carpooling easier. You can use her old sketchbooks if you want to scribble. I had spent that summer sitting on the sidelines of a clay court, the sun burning my shoulders, holding a racket I didn't want, watching my sister be cheered for every serve. I remembered my high school graduation. I was the valedictorian of my small arts magnet school. I had a speech prepared about the courage it takes to create. But the morning of the ceremony, Victoria called. She had been dumped by her college boyfriend and was in crisis. My parents spent the morning on the phone with her, soothing her ego, promising her a trip to Europe to heal. They arrived at my graduation 40 minutes late. They missed my speech. During the dinner afterward at a steakhouse Victoria liked, even though I was a vegetarian, all they could talk about was how brave Victoria was for navigating such a difficult emotional period. I had sat there, my gold tassel sitting on the table like a dead moth, tasting nothing but the metallic tang of my own suppressed resentment. "You're so lucky," Clara, my father, Robert, had whispered to me once, usually after Diane had finished a particularly long lecture about why I needed to be more like your sister. He'd catch me in the hallway and squeeze my shoulder. "You're the strong one. You don't need the fuss she does. You have your art. You're self-sufficient." It was a compliment that felt like a sentence. Because I was strong, I was the acceptable sacrifice. Because I didn't scream or throw tantrums or demand the spotlight, I was the one who could be forgotten. I looked at the phone on the counter. I thought about calling my father. I could picture him now, standing in the middle of their new, sterile condo, surrounded by Victoria's discarded boxes, probably feeling a dull ache of guilt in his chest. He loved me in his way, but his love was a quiet, cowardly thing. It didn't have teeth. It didn't have a spine. He would never stand up to Diane. And he would certainly never stand up to Victoria's needs. I picked up a pen. My hand was trembling, but my mind was beginning to clear. The house, Grandpa's house, was more than wood and stone. It was the only place I had ever felt truly seen. Grandpa used to let me paint on the walls of his workshop. He'd say, "The grain of the wood tells a story. Clara, you just have to be patient enough to listen." He had been listening, even when he was dying. He was listening to the way my parents talked about the property value while I was sitting by his bed reading him poetry. He knew they would try to erase me. I grabbed my laptop and searched for the law firm on the document. Sterling and Associates. They were still in business, located in a tall glass building downtown. I looked at the date on the calendar. Thanksgiving was in 3 days. My family was currently celebrating their windfall, toasted with expensive wine, bought with the blood of my grandfather's legacy. They were probably already planning how to decorate Victoria's New Hamptons house. A cold, steady resolve washed over me. For 29 years, I had played the role of the backup. I had been the understanding daughter, the quiet sister, the one who didn't mind the guest room or the late arrival or the forgotten birthday. I had been the one who took the hits so the real family could stay comfortable. I walked to my small closet and pulled out my best coat. It was a deep forest green, the color of the moss that grew on the north side of Grandpa's old shed. I checked my bank account. Enough for a train ticket and a decent meal. I wasn't going to call them back. I wasn't going to scream at my mother or beg my father for my share. That would just play into their narrative, that I was unstable or jealous. No, I was going to do exactly what Grandpa taught me to do. I was going to look at the grain of the wood. I was going to find the truth. I sat in my apartment as the sun went down, watching the shadows stretch across my floor. The radiator gave one final lonely hiss. My father had a chance to choose me. He had 1,000 chances over 1,000 dinners and 1,000 phone calls, and he chose silence instead. I tucked the onion skin paper into my bag. Tomorrow I would visit Sterling and Associates, and then I would find out exactly what happens when the quiet one finally finds her voice. The lobby of Sterling and Associates smelled of expensive floor wax and old money. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy, like it was designed to make people like me, people with paint under their fingernails and a constant calculation of rent in their heads, feel small. "I'm sorry, Ms. Vance," the receptionist said, her smile polite but professional. "Mr. Sterling passed away several years ago. The firm handles mostly corporate litigation now. Your grandfather's file would be in deep storage and without an appointment. It's about a property title," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I pulled the onion skin paper from my bag, and a breach of trust. "My parents sold the house yesterday. This paper says they couldn't." She paused, her eyes flickering to the document. Something about the way the light hit the notarized seal made her expression shift. "Let me see if someone from the estate department can give you 5 minutes." 5 minutes turned into 2 hours of waiting in a leather chair. I watched the city outside the glass walls. It was snowing, a gray, slushy New York snow that turned the world into a smudge. I realized I hadn't eaten since the phone call. My stomach felt like a cold stone. Finally, a young associate named Marcus took me into a small conference room. He was younger than me, with sharp eyes and a weary expression. He looked at the codicil, then at the copy of the deed I'd brought. He spent a long time on his computer, clicking through archives. "Your grandfather was clever," Marcus finally said, leaning back. "But Ms. Vance, I have to be honest. While this document is likely valid, the house has already been sold. The buyers are a development LLC. To freeze the funds or reverse this, you'd need a retainer that, well, it would be significant. And with it being 3 days before a holiday, the courts are closing. There's nothing I can do until next week." "Next week?" I whispered. "By next week, the money will be in my sister's escrow for her new house. It'll be gone. They'll have spent it." "I'm sorry," he said, and I could tell he actually meant it. Family law is a blood sport, and right now, they have the upper hand because they have the cash. Without the original document being filed at the county level, which it wasn't, you're looking at a multi-year uphill battle. I walked out of that building into the biting wind. The slush soaked through my boots instantly. I was 29 years old. I had $12 in my checking account because I'd spent the rest on the train ticket and the hope of a lawyer. My family was currently at a 5-star restaurant in the city, toasted by my sister's in-laws, laughing about their new minimalist condo life. I walked until my legs burned. I found myself in front of a small grocery store. The windows were decorated with plastic cornucopias and signs for organic turkeys. $80. I went inside, the bell chiming a mocking greeting. I walked to the deli counter. I couldn't afford a turkey. I couldn't even afford the sides. I bought a single, slightly bruised apple and a small carton of milk. Back at my apartment, the heat had gone out again. I sat on my floor, wrapped in a threadbare quilt my grandmother had made before she died. I didn't turn on the lights. I just watched the city glow through the window. The loneliness was a physical weight, pressing on my chest until it was hard to breathe. It wasn't just that I was poor. It was that I was disposable. If I disappeared tomorrow, my mother would probably worry about who would design the place, cards for Victoria's next gala. But she wouldn't mourn me. Not the real me. I picked up my phone. I had 3 missed calls from Victoria. I ignored them. Then a text from my father. Dad, I left a box of your old childhood things at the curb of the old house. The new owners want everything cleared by tomorrow. I'm sorry, Clara. I tried to save the drawings. But your mother said we didn't have room in the SUV. Happy Thanksgiving. I stared at the screen until the light dimmed and went black. He didn't even try. He watched them throw my life, my sketches, my awards, my history into a pile of trash on the sidewalk, and his only response was a text message sent from a warm car. I stood up. My joints were stiff, my heart feeling like it had finally shattered into pieces, too small to ever glue back together. I looked at the apple on my counter. No, I whispered to the empty room. I wasn't going to sit here and starve on the crumbs of their guilt. If I was going to be alone, if I was going to be the sacrifice, then I was going to do it with some goddamn dignity. I grabbed my coat. If I was going to eat Thanksgiving dinner alone, I was going to do it somewhere with actual food, with light, with life. I just had to find a restaurant that was still open, somewhere far away from the ghost of the family that had traded me for a Hampton zip code. I stepped out into the hall, the door clicking shut behind me. I didn't know where I was going. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for an invitation to exist. The wind whipped down the narrow alleyway as I stepped off the subway 2 stops further than I intended. I was in a neighborhood I barely recognized. Brownstones with glowing amber windows and the faint, teasing scent of cinnamon and roasting poultry drifting through the vents. It was the night before Thanksgiving, and the world seemed to be closing its doors, locking itself away in the warmth of shared laughter. I found myself standing in front of a small corner bistro called The Hearth. It looked like something out of a storybook: dark wood, gold lettering, and a window display filled with overflowing baskets of bread and dried lavender. I pushed the door open, and the sound of a small bell announced my arrival. The warmth hit me like a physical embrace. It smelled of rosemary and toasted pecans. "Table for one?" a voice asked. I looked up. A woman stood there, perhaps in her late 60s, with a crown of silver hair and eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of secrets. She was wearing a flour-dusted apron over a soft wool sweater. This was Eleanor. I know it's late, I stammered, clutching my bag, the one still holding the hidden codicil to my chest. I just need something small. A soup, anything? Eleanor didn't reach for a menu. She didn't look at my wind-burned face with the pity I expected. She simply reached out and took my coat. "You look like you've walked 100 miles in a 10-mile city. Dear, come. The kitchen is technically closing, but the family table is just sitting down." "Oh no, I couldn't intrude," I said, my face flushing. "I just wanted to pay for a meal." "Nonsense," she said, her voice firm but melodious. "My husband Richard made too much stuffing again. It's a character flaw. Besides, the bistro is closed to the public tonight. Tonight is for the strays and the stalwarts." She led me past the empty dining room into the back, where a large rustic wooden table was set. A man with steady hands and a quiet, protective aura, Richard, was carving a turkey. A younger man, probably in his early 30s, was pouring wine. He had dark, messy hair and a kind, observant expression that made me feel suddenly, strangely visible. "Richard, Marcus, look what the wind blew in," Eleanor said cheerfully. "This is..." "Clara," I whispered. "Clara?" Eleanor repeated, pulling out a heavy "We don't allow empty hearts or empty stomachs." Marcus, the younger man, looked up and froze. "We don't allow empty hearts or empty stomachs from this afternoon." I felt a surge of panic. Marcus, the younger man, looked up and froze for a second.
"I'll go. Stay."
"Wait, you're the girl from the law firm like he had at the office."
From this afternoon.
He looked human. I felt a surge of panic. "I helped my parents with the bistro
I didn't
on
know
the
you worked
holidays.
here.
I was thinking about your case all the way home."
Stay,
"Clara," Marcus said,
I felt
stepping
terrible
forward.
about how we had to
Richard
leave.
He didn't look weary like he had at the
office.
His gaze was grounded.
He
the
looked
kind of
human.
look my father never
I'm
had.
the son.
The look of a man who stood
so you're the one whose
family
holidays.
forgot what a legacy means.
I
felt a lump
about
form
your
in my
case all
throat,
the way
thick
home.
and painful.
I tried to
Clara,
swallow it,
but
but
the
the
kindness
terrible
in the
about
room
how
was
we had
more
to leave
overwhelming
things.
than the betrayal I
For the
suffered.
first time in 48 hours, I didn't have
to
be so
They sold it.
I
His
said,
gaze was
my voice
grounded.
cracking.
They sold my grandfather's
kind of
house
look my
while I was
father
still
never
mourning
had.
They
They
left
left
my childhood
the look
in a
of a
box
man
on
who
the
stood
curb.
his ground.
Eleanor placed a hand on my shoulder.
So you're the one whose family
steady,
forgot
and
what a
smelled
legacy
faintly
means.
of fresh
Tonight,
bread.
you're not a guest,
I felt a
Clara.
lump
Your
form in my
family
throat,
isn't just
thick and
about who
painful.
shared your
It's about
nursery.
who holds
I tried
the
to
light
swallow
when your
it,
world goes dark.
but the
She
kindness
handed me
in
a
the
plate.
room was
It
more
wasn't a little
overwhelming than the
project in a
betrayal I
regular side
suffered.
dish.
As I took my first
It was
bite
the
of
first
these
time in
crusted
48
turkey,
hours
and
I
heat
didn't
hitting
have
my
to be
tongue.
strong.
I felt a tear finally escape and
They
trail
sold
down
it.
my cheek.
No one
I said,
pointed
my
it
voice
out. No one
cracking.
told me I was being
They
dramatic.
sold my
Marcus
grandfather's
just
house while
quietly
I
refilled
refilled
my
my
water
water
glass.
Richard started telling a
They left my
rambling
childhood
story
in a
about a
box on
bread
the
kneading
curb.
machine that once
For the
exploded
first time
into
in my
hand
life,
on my
I
shoulder.
wasn't the acceptable
I
sacrifice.
was just a
Warm,
person at a
steady,
table
and smelled
and as the
faintly of
distant
fresh
sound of
bread.
city traffic hummed
The
outside,
icy grip
you're
of
not
the
a
last
guest,
few
Clara.
days began,
You're ours.
ever so slightly.
I looked at
because
Marcus,
family
who was
isn't just
watching
about
me
who
with a
shared
quiet,
your nursery.
curious
You said you
smile.
were
It's
thinking
about
about
who
who
holds
holds
the light when your world goes dark.
My father and I,
She
we
handed
don't
me a
like
plate.
bullies, Clara.
It wasn't a
And we
little
have things
project
about
or a
property law
side
that
dish.
go
beyond the
it was a
standard
feast,
retainer.
but that's for tomorrow.
As I
Tonight
took
you
my
just
first
eat.
bite of
I
the
grabbed my
herb-crusted
fork,
turkey.
my hands finally
The
stopped
salt
in their
come looking
trembling
for a
my
meal.
tongue. But as I looked
I
around
felt
the
a tear
table at these
finally
three
escape and
strangers,
trail down my
I might
cheek.
have found something much
No
more
one pointed it
dangerous to
out.
my
Plans,
parents.
a
No one told me
foundation.
I was being dramatic. Marcus just quietly refilled my water glass. And Richard started telling a hilarious, rambling story about a bread kneading machine that once exploded in the kitchen. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the acceptable sacrifice. I was just a person at a table. And as the distant sound of city traffic hummed outside, the icy grip of the last few days began, ever so slightly, to thaw. I looked at Marcus, who was watching me with a quiet, curious smile. You said you were thinking about my case? He nodded, leaning in. My father and I, we don't like bullies, Clara. And we happen to know a few things about property law that go beyond the standard retainer. But that's for tomorrow. Tonight you just eat. I grabbed my fork, my hands finally stopping their tremble. I had come looking for a meal. But as I looked around the table at these three strangers, I realized I might have found something much more dangerous to my parents. Plans, a foundation. The weeks following that Thanksgiving felt like waking up in a different world. The frantic, jagged edges of my life began to smooth out, replaced by the rhythmic pulse of the bistro. I had returned to the hearth 2 days after the holiday to thank Eleanor and Richard, and I never really left. Eleanor had discovered my background in floral design and my eye for aesthetics. The bistro has the soul, she'd said, waving a hand at the dark wood and copper pots, but it needs the grace. We need someone who can make this place look as good as the food tastes. Suddenly, I wasn't working 3 dead-end jobs just to survive. I was designing the window displays, arranging fresh centerpieces that smelled of eucalyptus and winter berries, and helping Marcus with the branding for their new line of artisanal breads. For the first time, my work wasn't a little project. It was the heartbeat of a business. You have a gift for light, Clara, Richard told me one afternoon. He was at the heavy prep table, his hands covered in flour. You see the beauty in the things most people walk past. That's a rare thing. Don't let anyone tell you it's a hobby. It was a Tuesday in early December when the first letter from my biological family arrived. I found it in the mail slot of my studio. It was from Victoria, heavy cream cardstock with a Hamptons postmark. Clara, we haven't heard from you. Mom is hurt that you're being so difficult about the condo. We're having a housewarming party on the 15th. It would look very odd if you weren't there. Don't make this a thing. Just come, have a drink, and let's move on. I'll even let you help me. Pick the curtains for the sunroom since you like that artsy stuff. I stared at the letter. In the past, I would have felt the familiar spike of guilt. I would have agonized over the wording of my reply, trying to find a way to decline without causing drama. But as I stood there, the scent of the bistro's rosemary bread still clinging to my sweater, the letter felt small. It felt like a script for a play I no longer wanted to act in. You're doing it again, a voice said from the doorway. I looked up. Marcus was leaning against the frame, holding 2 cups of steaming coffee. He had become my constant shadow, a steady presence who listened more than he spoke. He didn't offer platitudes. He offered solutions. Doing what? I asked, tucking the letter into my bag. Shrinking, he said simply. He walked over and handed me a cup. The warmth of the ceramic seeped into my palms. Every time you get a message from them, you physically get smaller. Your shoulders hunch. You look like you're apologizing for taking up air. It's just 29 years of habit, I sighed, leaning back against the counter. It's hard to unlearn that you're the supporting character in someone else's movie. Marcus set his coffee down and stepped closer. His eyes were a deep, grounding brown. In this building, Clara, you're the lead. My parents adore you. I look forward to seeing what you've created every morning. You aren't a backup plan here. He reached out, his hand hovering near mine before he gently covered my fingers with his. His skin was warm, his touch certain. I talked to the senior partners at the firm. We found the original filing for the codicil. Your grandfather didn't just write it. He mailed a copy to a third-party executor who kept it in a private vault. Your parents didn't find it because he didn't want them to. My breath caught. So it's real? It's enforceable? It's a legal landmine, Marcus said with a grim smile. They sold property they didn't technically have the right to sell without a unanimous vote. The title is clouded. The developers who bought it? They're going to be furious when they find out their clean deed is a mess. Felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in years, power, but it wasn't the jagged, angry power of revenge. It was the quiet, solid power of truth. What do? I asked. For now, nothing, Marcus said. We let them get comfortable. We let Victoria spend the money. We let them build their house of cards. And when the time is right, we pull the string. That evening, I didn't go back to my cold studio right away. I stayed at the bistro with Eleanor. We sat by the fireplace, the crackle of the wood the only sound in the room. She was knitting a sweater, a deep forest green. I never had a daughter, Eleanor said softly, her needles clicking a steady rhythm. I had Marcus, and I love him fiercely, but I always wondered what it would be like to have a woman in the house who saw the world the way I do. Someone who understands that a home isn't bought, Clara. It's grown. She looked at me over her glasses. You're growing here, child. I can see the color coming back to your cheeks. Don't let them take that from you again. I reached out and touched the soft wool of the sweater. I didn't think I'd ever feel safe again, I admitted, my voice a whisper. I thought once the house was gone I was just drifting. Eleanor reached over and squeezed my hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. You're not drifting. You've just changed harbors. And this one is protected from the storm. As I walked home that night, the snow beginning to fall in fat, silent flakes, I didn't look at my phone once. I didn't check for missed calls from my mother or snarky texts from Victoria. I just watched the way the streetlights turned the snowflakes into falling stars. I was learning that the loudest voices in my life weren't necessarily the ones telling the truth. And for the first time, I was starting to believe that I was worth more than the silence I had been forced to keep. By the time the city was draped in the glittering lights of late December, the bistro had become more than my workplace. It was my sanctuary. The air in the hearth always seemed to carry the scent of something wonderful: vanilla bean, toasted almonds, and the earthy, comforting smell of the wood-fired oven. But the real transformation wasn't in the decor. I had meticulously curated the cascading ivy, the hand-painted menus, the warmth of the amber bulbs. The real transformation was in the mirror. My pale, hollowed-out look had been replaced by a quiet glow. I had stopped flinching when the phone rang. I had started laughing again. And most of it was because of Marcus. One evening, after the last patrons had departed and the closed sign had been flipped, Marcus found me in the back garden. I was trying to string fairy lights through the bare branches of the cherry tree, my fingers numb from the biting cold. You're going to freeze your creative hands off, he said, stepping out into the crisp air. He wasn't wearing a coat, just a thick charcoal sweater that made his eyes look darker, more intense. I just wanted it to look perfect for the solstice dinner, I muttered, struggling with a tangled knot of wire. The light needs to hit the ice on the branches just right. Marcus stepped into my space, his warmth radiating off him like a physical force. He reached up, his much larger hands easily detangling the wires I had been fighting with. He didn't pull away once the knot was gone. He stayed close, his breath ghosting against my temple in white plumes. Clara, he said softly, you don't have to earn your place here by making everything perfect. You know that, right? I looked up at him. The fairy lights flickered to life, casting a soft golden glow across his face. I've spent my whole life being useful so people wouldn't notice I was there. It's a hard habit to break. I notice you, he whispered. I notice the way you bite your lip when you're sketching. I notice the way you always give the best piece of bread to the regulars who look lonely. I notice that you haven't realized yet how incredible you are. He leaned in, slow enough that I could have stepped back. But I didn't. I moved toward him. When his lips met mine, it wasn't like the movies. It was better. It was grounding. It tasted like the peppermint tea we'd shared earlier and felt like coming home after a very long walk in the rain. It was a choice. For the first time in my life, someone was choosing me, not for what I could do for them, but for exactly who I was. Wow, I breathed as we pulled apart. Marcus smiled, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw. Yeah, wow, now get inside before you turn into an ice sculpture. My mother will have my head if her favorite designer gets pneumonia. Inside, the bistro was a cocoon of warmth. Eleanor and Richard were sitting at the bar, sharing a bottle of red wine and looking over the ledger. They looked up as we walked in hand, and the look on Eleanor's face wasn't one of surprise. It was a deep knowing satisfaction. About time, Richard grunted, though his eyes were twinkling. I was beginning to think I'd have to start charging Marcus for all the time he spent staring at you instead of working on the zoning permits. Richard, leave them be, Eleanor chided, though she was beaming. She patted the stool next to her. Come, Clara, sit. We have something to talk to you about. I sat, feeling the familiar flutter of anxiety in my chest. Even now, a talk usually meant bad news in my world. We've lived a long life, Richard and I, Eleanor began, her voice taking on a serious, tender tone. We've built this place from nothing, but Marcus is our only child. And while he's a brilliant lawyer, his heart is half here and half in the courtroom. We've been looking for a way to ensure the hearth stays a family business. A real one. Richard reached across the counter and placed a heavy, calloused hand over mine. We know about the house, Clara. We know what those people took from you. But more importantly, we know what you've given us. You brought the light back into this building. We want to make it official, Eleanor said, her eyes glistening. We're updating our own estate. We want you to be part of it. Not just as an employee and not just as Marcus's. Whatever you two are becoming. We want you to be a daughter of this house, legally, formally. I felt the air leave my lungs. I don't understand. Adult adoption, Marcus explained, his voice steady and proud. It's a way to create a legal bond when the biological one has failed. It would make you a legal heir to the bistro and everything we have. It would mean you never have to worry about a place at the table ever again. I looked from Eleanor's maternal warmth to Richard's silent strength, then to Marcus, who was watching me with a look of pure, unadulterated hope. For years, I had been a ghost in my own family, a shadow flitting along the edges of Victoria's bright, loud life. I had been sold out for a vacation home and a condo gym. And here, in a room that smelled of flour and red wine, 3 people I had known for only a few months were offering me the one thing my parents never could, a foundation that couldn't be sold. You'd really want me? I whispered, the tears finally overflowing. After everything? I'm kind of a mess, legally speaking. We like a bit of a mess, Richard said, a slow smile spreading across his face. Makes for better stories. And besides, we've already seen the way you handle a crisis. You do it with grace, Clara. That's what that's what a member of this family does. I reached out and took Eleanor's hand on one side and Marcus's on the other. The weight of the last 5 years, the bitterness of the betrayal, the coldness of that Thanksgiving phone call, it didn't disappear, but it suddenly felt manageable. I wasn't an orphan of the heart anymore. Yes, I said, my voice gaining strength. I would love to be yours. As we toasted with the remains of the wine, I felt a quiet realization settle into my bones. My biological parents thought they had stripped me of my future when they sold my grandfather's house. They thought they had left me with nothing. But in trying to erase my inheritance, they had accidentally driven me toward my true legacy. And as Marcus squeezed my hand under the table, I knew that the last paper I held wasn't just a legal document. It was a map. And it had led me exactly where I was meant to be. The legal process for adult adoption was surprisingly quiet. A stark contrast to the loud, performative drama of my biological family. There were no shouting matches, no guilt-tripping phone calls, just the steady scratch of pens on heavy parchment in a sun-drenched office downtown. It's a rare thing, adult adoption, the judge had remarked, looking at us over his spectacles. He saw Eleanor and Richard standing behind me, their hands on my shoulders, and Marcus standing by my side. But looking at you four, I can see why it's necessary. The law is often about blood, but justice. Justice is about where you belong. When the final seal was pressed into the paper, I felt a physical weight lift off my chest. I was no longer a Vance in the eyes of the state. I was a member of a new lineage. I felt a strange, soaring sense of safety. For the first time in 30 years, I didn't have to wonder if I would be invited to Christmas or if my seat would be given to a guest with a higher social standing. I was permanent. But as the winter turned to a crisp, biting spring, the shadow of the past began to loom. Marcus and I were sitting in the bistro's office, surrounded by floor plans for our upcoming wedding. We wanted it simple: white lilies, the smell of fresh bread, and the warm glow of the bistro's hearth. But the peace was shattered by a notification on my laptop. It was a legal alert. Marcus had set up for the property title of my grandfather's house. "They've hit a wall," Marcus said, his voice dropping into his professional lawyer tone. The development LLC tried to pull the permits for the demolition of the house. The title company flagged the cloud. "Your parents have been served with a notice of interest, based on the codicil we filed." "What does that mean for them?" I asked, my heart beginning to race. "It means their clean sale is frozen," Marcus explained. "The money they received from the sale? The developers are suing to claw it back because the title wasn't clear. And because Victoria already used her portion as a down payment on the Hamptons house. They're in a massive liquidity crisis. They're facing breach of contract, fraud, and a very angry group of investors." I looked out the window. A small robin was perched on the cherry tree I had decorated with Marcus. "They'll come for me now," I whispered. "They won't be able to help themselves." "Let them come," Richard said from the doorway. He was holding a tray of almond biscotti, but his expression was iron. "A lion doesn't worry about the opinions of sheep." "Clara, and you're a lion now." The first strike came that evening. My phone, which had been blissfully quiet for weeks, exploded with messages. "Diane, Clara, pick up the phone this instant. Do you have any idea what you've done? Your sister is hysterical. They're threatening to seize her house. How could you be so selfish as to tie up the estate with some fake paper? Victoria, you've always been jealous, but this is a new low. You're literally trying to ruin my children's future because you're mad about a house you couldn't even afford the taxes on. Pull that filing now, or I swear, I'll make sure you never see a dime of anything ever again. Robert, Clara, please. Talk to your mother. We can settle this as a family. Don't let lawyers get involved. It's embarrassing for everyone." I read the messages with a strange sense of detachment. It was the same old song, the same old pattern. I was the one causing drama. Was the one being difficult. My father's plea for family actually meant do what makes your mother stop screaming. I didn't reply. Not that night. Not the next. Instead, I focused on the wedding. I chose a dress of simple cream-colored silk that felt like water against my skin. I worked with Eleanor to design a menu that celebrated the flavors of our chosen home. I felt a fierce, protective love for the life I was building. But I knew the confrontation was inevitable. They didn't want the house. They wanted the money. And more importantly, they wanted the control they had over me for 3 decades. "They're coming to the wedding, aren't they?" I asked Marcus one night as we lay on the sofa, the fire dying down in the grate. "They don't know where it is," he said, stroking my hair. "We kept the invitations private." "They'll find it," I said. "Victoria has a way of sniffing out anything that looks like a celebration she wasn't invited to. She can't stand the idea of me having something that isn't hers to give." "Then we'll be ready," Marcus promised. "But Clara, remember one thing. You don't owe them an explanation. You don't owe them your silence. And you certainly don't owe them your inheritance." I fell asleep that night dreaming of the old house. But in my dream, the house wasn't falling apart. It was glowing. And my grandfather was standing on the porch, holding a lantern. He wasn't looking at my parents. He was looking at me and he was smiling. He had known this would happen. He had given me the last paper not as a weapon, but as a shield. He knew that one day I would need to prove, not to them, but to myself, that I was worth fighting for. The wedding was scheduled for the following Saturday. The forecast called for clear skies and a gentle breeze. It was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. But as I looked at the stack of legal documents on the desk, I realized that before I could truly start my new life, I had to finally close the door on the old one, the golden child, and her architects were about to find out that the daughter they had discarded wasn't just holding a piece of paper. She was holding the keys to their undoing. The day of the wedding arrived with a sky the color of a robin's egg. The bistro was transformed. I had spent the morning tucking sprigs of fresh lily of the valley into every crevice, the air thick with their sweet, delicate scent. We had set the long wooden table in the back garden, the same place where I had first kissed Marcus under the fairy lights. I stood in the small dressing room upstairs, looking at myself in the mirror. The cream silk of my dress glowed. For the first time, I didn't see the quiet daughter or the acceptable sacrifice. I saw a woman who was loved. "You look like a dream, Clara," Eleanor whispered, stepping in. She reached up and adjusted my veil. Her hands didn't tremble. She looked at me with a pride so fierce it brought tears to my eyes. "Are you ready?" "I am," I said. And I meant it. The ceremony was brief and beautiful. Richard stood at the front, his eyes moist as he watched Marcus take my hand. We exchanged vows that spoke of foundations, of chosen paths, and of the quiet strength found in the hearth. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, a cheer went up from the small group of bistro regulars and friends who had become our world. But as the first notes of the cello began to play for our reception, the heavy front doors of the bistro swung open with a bang that echoed through the room. The music faltered. The laughter died. In the doorway stood my biological family. Diane was in a sharp, expensive suit, her face a mask of calculated fury. Victoria stood beside her, her eyes darting around the bistro with a look of pure disdain. Behind them, my father, Robert, looked at his shoes, his shoulders slumped in his usual posture of defeated compliance. "Well, isn't this quaint?" Victoria said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "I see where the stolen money went. You bought yourself a little playhouse and a husband." "Victoria, that's enough," I said. My voice was calm. It was a sound I didn't recognize. Steady, grounded, and entirely without fear. I stepped forward, Marcus moving instinctively to my side. "Enough?" Diane stepped into the center of the room, ignoring the guests. "Clara, you have 48 hours to drop that frivolous legal claim. Do you have any idea what you've done? They've frozen your sister's accounts. They're threatening to put a lien on the Hamptons' property. You've humiliated us." "I humiliated you?" I asked. I walked toward her, the silk of my dress hissing softly against the floor. "You sold Grandpa's house behind my back. You threw my life onto a curb and trash bags. You told me I didn't have a place at your table for the holidays because you were too busy spending my inheritance." "It wasn't yours!" Victoria shrieked. "You're an artist. You have no sense of value. We did what was best for the family estate." "The family estate?" I turned to my father. "Dad? Is that what you think? That selling the only place I ever felt safe was best for me?" Robert looked up, his eyes glassy. "Clara, it's just a house. We thought you'd understand. We're your blood." "No," I said, and the word felt like a mountain. "You're my DNA. But you stopped being my family the moment you decided. I was a commodity you could trade for a better zip code." I reached into the small silk bag tied to my wrist and pulled out a single, folded piece of paper. Not the original codicil that was safe in a vault, but a legal notice of the adult adoption. "I'm not a Vance anymore," I said, handing the paper to my mother. "I was adopted by Eleanor and Richard this morning. Legally, I am their daughter. And as for the house," I looked at Victoria, who was turning a ghostly shade of white. "The codicil states that because the sale was attempted without unanimous consent, the entire proceeds of the sale, every cent, must be returned to the trust. If they aren't, the developer has the right to sue the individuals who signed the deed for fraud. That's you, Mom, and you, Dad." "You wouldn't," Diane whispered, the paper trembling in her hand. "You wouldn't send your own parents to court?" "I don't have to," I said. I felt Marcus's hand on the small of my back, a warm, solid reminder of where I now belonged. "The law's doing it for me. You spent money that didn't belong to you. You broke Grandpa's trust. I'm just the one who stopped pretending it didn't happen." "Clara, please." My father stepped forward, his hand outstretched. "We're your family." "My family is right here," I said, gesturing to Eleanor and Richard, who stood like twin pillars of stone behind me. They gave me a name. They gave me a home. They gave me a seat at the table when I had nothing. You had everything, and you still wanted more. I stepped back, closing the distance between me and my new life. "The back door is open," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried in the absolute silence of the room. "Please use it. My family is having a celebration, and there are no seats left for strangers." For a moment, it looked like Diane would scream. Her face contorted, her hands balled into fisted rage. But she looked at the room, at the steady, unblinking eyes of the people who truly loved me, and she realized she had no power here. No guilt could reach me. No silence could break me. They turned and walked out, Victoria's heels clicking a frantic, desperate rhythm on the floor. My father was the last to leave. He paused at the door, looking back at me for one long, haunting second. I waited for him to say it, to say he was sorry, to say he loved me, to say anything. He just turned and followed his wife into the night. The door clicked shut. The silence held for a heartbeat, and then Richard walked over to the cellist. "Play," he commanded gently. The music swelled, richer and deeper than before. Marcus pulled me into his arms, his forehead resting against mine. I could smell the lilies, the wood smoke, and the scent of rain on the pavement outside. I had lost a house. I had lost a name. But as I danced with my husband in the heart of our home, I realized I had finally found the one thing that can't be sold, traded or stolen. I had found myself. The weeks following the wedding felt like the slow, deep breath the earth takes after a violent summer storm. The air was clearer, the world felt sharper, and for the first time in my life, the constant, low-level hum of anxiety in my chest had simply stopped. The legal fallout for my biological family was swift and clinical. Marcus kept me updated, though he never let the darkness of their situation touch our home. Without the unanimous consent required by the codicil, the sale of Grandpa's house was declared a breach of fiduciary duty. My parents were forced to liquidate their new condo to repay the developers. Victoria, unable to return the funds she had already sunk into her Hamptons renovation, had to sell that property at a loss just to avoid a fraud conviction. They ended up exactly where they had tried to leave me, looking for a place to belong. But unlike me, they had burned every bridge that led to a real home. I received one final letter from my father a month later. It was written on plain notebook paper, the handwriting shaky. He didn't ask for money, and he didn't ask for a seat at the table. He simply wrote, "I found the drawings. The ones I told you were thrown away. I had hidden them in the trunk of my car. I've mailed them to the bistro. You were always so talented, Clara. I'm sorry I only watched the shadows." When the box arrived, I opened it in the garden. Inside were years of my life, sketches of the old porch, watercolors of the cherry blossoms, charcoal portraits of Grandpa. I sat on the grass and cried, not for the man who sent them, but for the little girl who had thought she had to hide her heart to be loved. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked, coming out to join me. He sat on the grass and pulled me into his lap, his chin resting on my shoulder. "I am," I said, wiping my eyes. "I'm finally at peace with the ghosts." As spring turned to the lush, heavy heat of summer, our life at the bistro reached a new rhythm. Eleanor and Richard officially retired, handing the keys of the hearth to Marcus and me. We didn't change much. The soul of the place was perfect. But we added a small gallery wall in the back, where my paintings, the ones my father had saved, hung alongside, the fresh floral arrangements I created every morning. But the most beautiful change was one we hadn't planned. It started with a morning of uncharacteristic fatigue and a sudden, intense craving for Eleanor's sourdough bread. 2 pink lines on a plastic stick later, and our world shifted once again. I remember telling Eleanor in the kitchen. She was teaching me the secret to her lemon tart when I simply handed her the test. She looked at it, then at me, and her eyes filled with a light that rivaled the morning sun. She didn't say a word. She just folded me into an embrace that smelled of sugar and unconditional love. "A new generation for the hearth," she whispered into my hair. That evening, I sat on the porch of the apartment above the bistro, watching the city lights flicker on. I placed my hand over my stomach, feeling a sense of fierce, protective power. This child would never know what it felt like to be a backup plan. They would never have to earn a seat or wonder if their inheritance would be traded for someone else's comfort. They would grow up in a house built on truth, seasoned with laughter, and anchored by a family that chose each other every single day. I looked at the last paper, the adoption certificate, which I had framed and hung in our hallway. It wasn't just a document anymore. It was a promise kept. I had been the girl who was sold out, but I had become the woman who built a fortress. The sun dipped below the skyline, casting long golden shadows across the garden. I heard Marcus's laughter from downstairs, followed by the clink of glasses as the first dinner guests arrived. Life was moving forward, rich and messy and beautiful. I was no longer waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was the one walking in the shoes I had chosen for myself. And the path ahead looked like everything I had ever dreamed of, and more. The first snow of the year is falling now, fat and silent, coating the city in a layer of crystalline white. I am sitting in the large bay window of the bistro, The same spot where I once sat as a stranger with $12 in my pocket and a shattered heart. Beside me, a small wooden cradle rocks gently. My daughter, Alara, named for the woman who became my mother when I needed one, most, is fast asleep, her tiny fist curled against her cheek. She is 3 months old, and she is the most beautiful thing I have ever created. I look around at the life I've built. Richard is in the kitchen, teaching a new apprentice how to hear the thump of a perfectly baked loaf. Eleanor is at the bar, laughing with a regular who has been coming here since the day I arrived. And Marcus is across the room, catching my eye with a wink that still makes my heart skip a beat. I think back to that phone call 5 years ago. I think about the girl who stood in a drafty studio, crumbling a dried flower in her hand. If I could go back and speak to her, I wouldn't tell her that the pain goes away. I would tell her that the pain is the fertilizer. I had to be discarded to find where I truly belonged. I had to lose a house to find a home. I've learned that family isn't a debt you owe to the people who share your blood. It's a gift you give to the people who share your soul. Boundaries aren't walls built to keep people out. They are the gates that protect the peace you've worked so hard to grow. My self-worth isn't a little project anymore. It is the foundation of everything I touch. My biological parents and Victoria are shadows now, existing in a world of ledgers and appearances. I don't hate them. Hate is too heavy a thing to carry into a life this light. I simply release them. I chose the last paper, the one that said I was someone else's daughter, and in doing so, I finally became my own woman. As the hearth fire crackles, sending a warm, amber glow across the room, I realize that the greatest inheritance my grandfather left me wasn't a house. It was the courage to stay quiet until I had something worth saying, and the strength to say it when the time came. The wood grain tells a story, he used to say, and mine is just beginning. CTA section, if you're watching this and you've been the scapegoat of your family, if you've been told you're too much or too sensitive, or always causing drama just because you dare to ask to be treated fairly, I want you to know something. It's not you. It never was. You deserve to be chosen. Not as a backup, not as a last resort, not as the acceptable sacrifice when someone else's comfort is at stake. Chosen first. Chosen fully. Chosen without conditions. Family isn't blood. Family isn't obligation. Family isn't people who share your DNA but treat you like a burden. Family is the people who show up. The people who see you crying alone and invite you to their table. The people who open their hearts and their homes and make you officially, permanently, undeniably theirs. I spent 29 years trying to earn love from people who were never going to give it. And then I spent 5 years learning what love actually looks like. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. It helps more people find these stories when they need them most. I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to set boundaries with your own family? Share your experience in the comments. I read every single one. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing how far this story reaches. And if you want more stories like this, check the description. I've linked some of my favorites there. Until next time, remember, and you deserve to be chosen.